On November 24, 1326, in the English city of Hereford, a public spectacle of extreme brutality unfolded. Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man whose name had become synonymous with tyranny and avarice across England, was brought to face a predetermined fate. The sentence for treason in this era was fixed, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Yet it was not merely the horror of the execution itself that etched this day into the annals of English history, but the presence of a specific observer, Isabella of France, Queen Consort of England, wife to Edward II, and the woman whose political manoeuvring had brought Despenser to this grim end, was allegedly among those who watched. The historical record suggests her comportment was far from detached. Some accounts imply a deep satisfaction, even an active desire for the prolonged agony of the man who had become her bitterest enemy. This moment at Hereford is more than a simple act of medieval justice. It is a lens through which to examine the raw, personal nature of power, vengeance, and the stark realities of a queen's struggle for survival. Our inquiry seeks to understand not just the details of Despenser's demise, but what Isabella's alleged role reveals about the moral landscape of her time. To comprehend the Queen's journey to this moment, we must first turn to her origins. Born around 1295, Isabella was a scion of one of Europe's most formidable royal houses, the Capetians of France. Her father was Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, a monarch whose reign was characterized by ruthless efficiency, financial acumen, and a willingness to confront powerful institutions like the papacy. Isabella's upbringing was precisely what one would expect for a princess of such high station. She received instruction in religious piety, the intricacies of courtly etiquette, and an early understanding of her destined role as a political instrument. Royal daughters, after all, were valuable commodities, not for their personal happiness, but for the strategic alliances they could forge through marriage. Her union with Edward II of England, solemnized with great pomp and circumstance in 1308, was a calculated move to resolve long-standing territorial disputes, particularly over the strategically vital Duchy of Gascony, and to secure a fragile peace between the two dominant powers of Western Europe. Isabella arrived on English shores as a young girl, burdened by the immense political expectations of two rival kingdoms. She was, in essence, a living treaty, a diplomatic pawn in the grand chess game of European dynastic politics. Her personal inclinations were secondary to the stability she was meant to represent. Isabella's initial experience of the English court proved to be a difficult introduction to her new reality. Her husband, Edward II, was a man whose character deviated significantly from the traditional martial and governmental expectations placed upon a medieval king. Unlike his formidable father, Edward I, a warrior king who had consolidated royal power and waged relentless campaigns, Edward II seemed largely uninterested in the rigors of governance or the demands of warfare. His preferences leaned instead towards the company of close male companions, a predilection that immediately manifested in the unparalleled prominence of Piers Gaveston. Gaveston, a Gascon knight whom Edward had known since childhood, was not merely a friend but a highly favoured confidant. His rapid elevation through the ranks, coupled with an insolent demeanour and a tendency to mock the English nobility, quickly ignited fierce resentment among the powerful barons. They viewed Gaveston's immense influence as a direct affront to their own status and a corrosive stain upon the dignity of the crown itself. Isabella, a young queen still finding her footing in a foreign land, found herself caught in the cross-currents of this bitter personal favoritism, a dynamic that would define her own struggle for influence and ultimately her very survival. The initial glamour of her royal marriage quickly faded into the stark reality of a court divided by personal resentments and a king seemingly more devoted to a single companion than to his queen or his realm. The conflict over Piers Gaveston did not merely simmer, it escalated rapidly, becoming the defining feature of Edward II's early reign and setting a dangerous precedent for royal favourites. The English barons, led by the formidable Thomas of Lancaster, a cousin to the king and the wealthiest magnate in England, repeatedly forced Edward to banish Gaveston. Yet, each exile was invariably followed by Gaveston's defiant return, often with greater titles and wealth bestowed upon him by a king seemingly incapable of functioning without his companion. This cycle of banishment and return reached a boiling point with the implementation of the Ordinances of 1311. These were a comprehensive set of reforms, effectively forced upon Edward by the baronage, designed to limit royal power, establish conciliar government, and, crucially, permanently banish Gaveston. The king's continued defiance pushed the barons to their ultimate limits. In 1312, Gaveston was captured by Lancaster's forces and, in a stark display of baronial power, executed without a formal trial. This extrajudicial killing, a direct challenge to royal authority, served as a grim and undeniable warning about the dangers of unchecked royal favoritism and the brutal lengths to which the magnates would go to enforce their will and protect their perceived rights. For Isabella, Gaveston's dramatic and violent demise provided an indelible lesson in the ruthless power dynamics of the English court, a lesson in how quickly favour could turn to fatal hatred. It was a lesson she would later apply with devastating effect. With Gaveston removed, the void at the centre of Edward II's affections did not remain empty for long. Into this strategic vacuum stepped a father and son duo, Hugh Despencer the elder, and more fatefully, Hugh Despencer the younger. The younger Despencer, a man of considerable ambition and charm, quickly eclipsed all rivals for Edward's favour. From a relatively minor figure at court, he ascended with astonishing speed, becoming royal chamberlain and, in practical terms, the king's undisputed chief advisor and de facto co-ruler. This meteoric rise was fueled by an insatiable hunger for land, wealth and power. Despencer ruthlessly exploited his unparalleled proximity to the king, leveraging royal authority to acquire vast estates, often through highly questionable, if not outright illegal means. He dispossessed numerous nobles, intimidated lesser landowners, and even clashed with powerful church officials in his relentless pursuit of property. His blatant avarice, coupled with an arrogance that rivaled Gaveston's, alienated vast swathes of the English nobility, creating a new and even more formidable opposition to Edward's already unstable reign. The irony was not lost on many. The king, having lost his first favourite to baronial fury, had merely replaced him with another, even more grasping and universally loathed figure. As Hugh Despencer the younger's influence solidified, Isabella's own position at court suffered a dramatic and precipitous decline. Despencer, acutely aware of the Queen's potential as a rival for the king's ear, and a possible rallying point for disaffection, actively worked to undermine her status and authority. He systematically encroached upon her dower lands, which were not merely a source of income, but the very foundation of a queen's financial independence and her ability to exercise patronage. This was a direct assault on her power base. Chroniclers of the period, whose accounts must always be read with an understanding of their potential biases, nonetheless consistently suggest that Isabella was subjected to increasing levels of humiliation. Accounts detail her being denied access to vital resources, her household diminished, and perhaps most painfully, being separated from her own children, whom Edward and Despencer allegedly kept under their direct restrictive control. Edward II, whether from a genuine emotional dependence on Despencer or a complete political subservience, did little if anything to protect his wife from these indignities. This systematic disempowerment, the slow erosion of her dignity and maternal rights, pushed Isabella to a psychological and political breaking point. Her initial loyalty to her husband, strained by years of neglect and favoritism, finally fractured, replaced by a deep, simmering resentment that would eventually compel her to seek radical and dangerous solutions. A critical diplomatic opportunity emerged in 1325, offering Isabella a desperate chance to escape the increasingly intolerable conditions of the English court. Edward II, seeking to resolve lingering disputes over Gascony with the French crown, dispatched Isabella to her homeland to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV of France. It was a mission that provided her with both a lifeline and a stage for unprecedented defiance. Once in France, Isabella made a pivotal and scandalous decision. She openly declared her refusal to return to England unless Hugh Despencer the Younger was permanently exiled from the court and stripped of his power. This was not merely a domestic dispute, it was a public and unprecedented act of defiance by a queen against her reigning husband, transforming a family drama into an international political crisis. While in France, Isabella orchestrated an even more consequential move. She solidified a powerful alliance with Roger Mortimer, a prominent English baron who had previously been exiled by Edward and Despencer for his opposition to their regime. Mortimer, a charismatic and ruthless figure, shared Isabella's profound grievances against Edward's rule. Their shared hatred of Despencer and their mutual desire to unseat Edward's favourites forged a potent personal and political partnership. This alliance laid the intricate groundwork for a direct and potentially violent challenge to the English crown, marking Isabella's metamorphosis from a marginalised queen into a formidable and dangerous political actor. She had finally found her leverage. With the alliance between Isabella and Roger Mortimer firmly established, the two began the arduous task of gathering the necessary forces and resources for an invasion of England. Their efforts bore fruit, particularly in Hainault, where they secured military aid and crucial financial backing from Count William I. This alliance was cemented by a strategic betrothal. Isabella's young son, Edward, the future Edward III, was promised to William I's daughter Philippa. English exiles and disaffected nobles, weary of the Despencer regime's rapacity and the king's ineffective rule, flocked to Isabella's cause, eager to overthrow the detested favourites. Isabella proved herself a remarkably astute propagandist. She skillfully leveraged her royal status and her widely perceived suffering at the hands of the Despensers, positioning herself not as a rebellious wife, but as the wronged queen, the liberator of England from tyranny. The narrative presented to the English people and to European courts was one of a queen acting bravely on behalf of the realm's welfare, a stark contrast to Edward II's perceived misrule and his obsessive devotion to his favourites. This was a radical and profoundly dangerous undertaking for a queen. By leading an invasion, Isabella definitively broke from the traditional subservient expectations of her role. It was a gamble that could easily have led to her own execution for treason. The invasion of England, launched by Isabella and Mortimer in September 1326, landed on the coast of Suffolk. The operation was remarkably swift and decisive, much to Edward II's apparent astonishment. The widespread discontent with the Dispenser regime meant that very few rallied to the king's defence. Instead, local levies, elements of the royal army, and disaffected nobles defected en masse to Isabella's banner. It was almost as if the country had been waiting for anyone, to challenge the existing order. Edward II, by this point largely abandoned by much of his nobility and facing a rapidly collapsing government, fled westward with Hugh Despenser the Younger and a small, increasingly desperate retinue. Their frantic flight was a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to find refuge from the collapsing loyalty of their kingdom. The speed and decisiveness of the invasion underscored the sheer depth of the opposition to Edward, and more pointedly, to the Despensers. It was a testament to Isabella's political acumen and the collective desire of the English populace for change, even if that change came at the hands of a foreign-born queen and her exiled lover. As Isabella and Mortimer advanced through the crumbling kingdom, their primary objective became twofold: the capture of the king, Edward II, and, crucially, the apprehension of Hugh Despenser the Younger. The royal fugitives, constantly on the run, were eventually cornered in South Wales, near Llantrisant Castle, in November 1326. Their desperate flight had proven utterly futile. There was nowhere left to hide. While Edward II's capture was a political necessity for Isabella to legitimise the impending transfer of power, the capture of Despenser was arguably even more significant on a personal and symbolic level. Despenser was widely seen as the true architect of the regime's abuses, the embodiment of their oppression, and the personal tormentor of the Queen. His capture represented the tangible victory over the tyranny Isabella had so vehemently fought against. The decision was swiftly made to bring Despenser to Hereford, a strategically important city in the Welsh Marches, where he would face immediate judgment for his multitude of alleged crimes against the realm. It was to be a highly public reckoning, designed to both punish the individual and send an unmistakable message to the kingdom. Hugh Despenser the Younger was brought before a tribunal assembled at Hereford, a court effectively presided over by Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and the leading nobles of their victorious faction. The charges levelled against him were comprehensive and damning: high treason, widespread corruption, the usurpation of royal authority, and the systematic oppression of the realm's subjects. In the context of medieval legal processes, which often bore little resemblance to modern concepts of due process, this was, in essence, a show trial. Its primary purpose was not to establish guilt through impartial evidence, but to legitimize the new regime and to appease the deeply embittered populace who had suffered under Despenser's avarice. Despenser himself was explicitly denied the right to speak in his own defense. His condemnation was a foregone conclusion. Historical accounts indicate that the proceedings were remarkably brief, leading swiftly to a predetermined verdict of guilt. The nature of medieval justice dictated that punishments for treason were not only severe but also meticulously public, designed not merely to exact retribution but to serve as a stark and terrifying warning to any who might dare to defy the crown's authority. The specific sentence long established for cases of treason was the particularly gruesome hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was a deliberate act of public terror and a demonstration of absolute power. On November 24, 1326, the sentence against Hugh Despenser the Younger was carried out in Hereford. Contemporary chroniclers, such as Jean Froissart and the author of the Lanercost Chronicle, provide accounts of this brutal event. Despenser was first hanged, but the process was carefully managed so that he would be cut down while still alive. Then followed the drawing, where his entrails were removed and burned before his eyes. Finally, his body was dismembered into 4 quarters, which were then dispatched to various parts of the kingdom to be displayed as a grim deterrent warning. The crux of our investigation into Isabella's role centres on her presence during this horrific event. Multiple chroniclers confirm she was indeed present at the execution. The accounts diverge slightly regarding her precise demeanour, a common challenge when interpreting medieval sources, which were often written with inherent biases, whether supporting or condemning the actions of powerful figures. Some chroniclers suggest a stoic observation, perhaps indicative of a queen exercising her authority. Others imply a distinct grim satisfaction, hinting at the depth of her personal animosity towards Despenser. A few even go so far as to suggest she may have taken pleasure in the prolonging of his suffering. While the precise emotional nuance of her presence remains open to interpretation, the consistent detail of her attendance across multiple independent accounts points strongly to its historical veracity. It was not an event she shied away from. Isabella's alleged presence and comportment at Despenser's execution invite complex and multi-layered interpretations, resisting any single simplistic explanation. One compelling perspective views her actions as a profound act of personal vengeance. For years, Despenser had systematically worked to humiliate her, stripping her of her dower lands, separating her from her children, and eroding her queenly dignity. Watching his agonizing death could therefore be understood as a deeply cathartic and retributive act, a payoff for years of suffering and political marginalization. From this viewpoint, it was a moment where the personal finally intersected with the political, allowing her to witness the ultimate downfall of her tormentor. Alternatively, her presence could be interpreted as a calculated and cold political statement. In the brutal world of medieval power, public executions of powerful enemies served as an unmistakable demonstration of the new regime's authority and ruthlessness. It was a clear, unambiguous message sent to any who might consider resisting Isabella and Mortimer's freshly consolidated power. Furthermore, Despenser, as Edward's absolute favourite, was often seen as a surrogate for the king himself. In this light, Isabella's observation of his demise could be interpreted as witnessing the symbolic and intensely personal defeat of the man who had supplanted her in her husband's life and affections. Her actions must also be critically viewed within the broader context of medieval societal norms, where public executions were not only common but were expected, even demanded, spectacles for serious crimes like treason. The populace expected justice to be seen, and often to be grim. In the immediate aftermath of Despenser's gruesome execution, the political landscape of England was rapidly reshaped. Edward II was formally deposed in January 1327 by a parliament assembled by Isabella and Mortimer, his own son Edward III being proclaimed king in his stead. The former monarch himself died in Berkeley Castle in September 1327, under deeply suspicious circumstances. While an official verdict was given of natural causes, it is widely believed by historians that Edward II was almost certainly murdered under the explicit direction of Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who sought to remove any lingering threat to their newfound power. With Edward III still a minor, Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled as regents for the young king. Their period of absolute power was largely characterized by relentless efforts to consolidate their authority, secure their gains, and reward their allies. However, their rule eventually faced its own formidable challenges, particularly from a maturing Edward III, who increasingly resented their absolute control and the persistent damning rumours surrounding his father's death. In a decisive and dramatic coup in 1330, Edward III seized Mortimer, orchestrating his swift trial and execution. Isabella, stripped of her power, was subsequently placed under effective house arrest, albeit a comfortable one, where she lived out the remainder of her life. While not a prisoner in the conventional sense, her political influence was completely diminished. Her historical legacy, indelibly marked by the moniker She-Wolf of France, has been profoundly shaped by chroniclers, playwrights, and later dramatizations, many of which emphasized her perceived cruelty, ruthlessness, and the extraordinary lengths to which she went to achieve her aims. Our investigation into the complex figure of Isabella of France and her connection to the execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger reveals a historical event deeply embedded in the brutal realities of medieval power and personal vendetta. While the precise emotional details of Isabella's demeanor at the execution remain subject to the inherent biases of contemporary chroniclers, her confirmed presence at such a gruesome spectacle is a significant historical fact. The execution itself, while horrific by modern standards, was a standard, legally sanctioned form of medieval justice for the crime of treason. This story compels us to look beyond any romanticized or sanitized notions of medieval royalty and to instead engage directly with the harsh truths of the past. It starkly exposes how personal grievances, relentless political ambition, and the accepted societal norms of a violent age could converge in acts of profound cruelty. We have aimed not to sensationalize the violence of Despenser's death, but to understand the factual circumstances of what happened, who was involved, and the social, legal, and political conditions that not only permitted such events but often demanded them. The narrative of Isabella, tracing her journey from a politically vulnerable royal pawn to a powerful queen who orchestrated the downfall of her enemies, vividly underscores the extreme stakes in medieval courtly life. It serves as a potent reminder that history is rarely a simple tale of clear good and evil, but rather a deeply human saga where individuals navigated immensely complex circumstances, often with brutal outcomes, within a world fundamentally different from our own. It stands as a stark example of how unchecked power, fueled by a thirst for retribution, could lead to extraordinary and devastating ends for all involved.